Here, 40 years ago exactly, around 10 a.m. in the morning. Out from this door was Ken Rex McElroy and his wife Trina.
Ken Rex McElroy, a name that will forever be associated with violence, fear, and an unrelenting reign of terror over the small town of Skidmore, Missouri, was a figure who struck terror into the hearts of many. Born in 1934 to a family of poor migrant farmers, McElroy quickly became notorious for his aggressive and violent nature. From an early age, it was clear that McElroy had a dark side. By the age of 15, he had dropped out of high school and began making a name for himself, not for any skill or achievement, but for his ruthless, bullying ways. As he grew older, his actions only became more violent and criminal. McElroy was known throughout the town as a cattle rustler and small-time thief. Whether it was alcohol, gasoline, grain, livestock, or even antiques, McElroy seemed to be involved in stealing just about anything he could get his hands on. Yet, despite the frequent accusations, McElroy never seemed to face any consequences for his actions. How? His tactics were simple but effective. Intimidation. McElroy used brute force, threats, and sheer violence to silence anyone who might speak out against him. It was a tactic that made him nearly untouchable by the law, and one that worked again and again, much to the frustration of the townspeople who lived in fear of him. But McElroy's criminal activities were not confined to petty theft and bullying. His reputation grew darker as he committed more heinous acts, including an ongoing pattern of violence toward those who crossed him. The case of Romaine Henry, a farmer who had the misfortune of confronting McElroy about gunfire on his property, exemplified McElroy's willingness to escalate any situation into a violent confrontation. In 1976, after Henry attempted to confront McElroy didn't back down. He shot at Henry. This act of violence was just another chapter in McElroy's long list of violent run-ins with others. When Henry tried to press charges, McElroy used his notorious intimidation tactics again, repeatedly driving his pickup truck to Henry's farm, attempting to scare him into withdrawing the charges. Despite this, Henry stood his ground, but ultimately McElroy was acquitted. As was often the case, McElroy's violent actions had gone unpunished, leaving behind a trail of frustrated and scared witnesses who knew they could not stand up to him. However, McElroy's most sinister and disturbing crime involved his relationship with Trina McLeod. Trina's story was one of manipulation, abuse, and unrelenting control by McElroy. Starting when she was just 12 years old, McElroy, who was over 20 years her senior, began obsessively following her and harassing her, including regularly stalking her school bus. His behavior was so aggressive that he would make the bus driver pull over and allow him to take Trina. What followed was a twisted and horrifying courtship in which McElroy preyed on Trina, abusing her both mentally and physically. At just 14 years old, Trina gave birth to their first child. When she tried to escape McElroy's hold, returning to her parents' home, McElroy tracked her down, forcibly brought her back, and continued his reign of terror. Even Trina's parents were too afraid to intervene, as McElroy made clear that he would harm anyone who stood in his way. McElroy's fury reached its peak when Trina's mother and stepfather refused to allow him to marry their underage daughter. In a violent fit of rage, McElroy killed the family's dog and burned their house to the ground. He was later indicted for statutory rape, arson, and assault, but this did little to stop him. Trina and their child were placed in foster care, but McElroy didn't relent. He continued to harass the foster family, threatening to kidnap their biological daughter unless they allowed Trina to return to him. Trina, trapped in this vicious cycle, eventually recanted her earlier statements and married McElroy in 1974. This legal marriage allowed McElroy to avoid any criminal charges, despite the horrific nature of their relationship. McElroy's abusive tactics continued even after they married, as he had multiple children with other women, including his common-law wife, Alice. His behavior had become so brazen that even the legal system couldn't contain him. This pattern of violence and criminality continued throughout McElroy's life, with numerous incidents of intimidation, harassment, and violent outbursts. His crimes escalated, and while he was arrested several times, he always found a way to avoid justice. The people of Skidmore were in constant fear of McElroy. who seemed untouchable. His bullying, violent actions, and criminal deeds cast a long shadow over the town, and his ability to escape punishment emboldened him to continue terrorizing those around him. By the time McElroy was involved in the shooting of Ernest Bo Bowenkamp in 1980, he had already established himself as a force to be reckoned with, a man above the law, whose wrath could not be contained. In the aftermath of this violent confrontation, the town's frustration with McElroy's reign of terror reached a boiling point. The people of Skidmore, despite living in fear for so long, began to realize that the legal system was powerless to stop him. With McElroy's continued threats and violent actions, the community was beginning to take matters into their own hands, even if it meant breaking the law. But no one could have foreseen the final confrontation that would bring McElroy's reign of terror to a shocking and tragic end. The events surrounding the attempted murder of Ernest Bo Bowenkamp in 1980 marked a turning point in the simmering tensions between Ken Rex McElroy and the town of Skidmore. Bowenkamp, a 70-year-old grocery store owner, became the target of McElroy's wrath after a small altercation involving McElroy's daughter allegedly stealing candy from Bowenkamp's store. McElroy, never one to back down from a confrontation, didn't just let the issue slide. Instead, he responded with a terrifyingly violent proposal. He offered Lois Bowenkamp money to fight his wife, Trina. The absurdity of the offer highlighted McElroy's utter disregard for human decency and his twisted sense of entitlement. When Lois refused, McElroy's temper flared, and he began stalking the Bowenkamps, following them outside their store in his pickup truck, a rifle often in hand. The situation escalated when, in the summer of 1980, McElroy cornered Ernest Bowenkamp on the loading dock of his store. With two young boys watching the scene unfold, McElroy made sure they were sent away to buy sodas before unleashing violence. He shot Bowenkamp in the neck, leaving him seriously wounded. This act was yet another example of McElroy's unbridled violence and his complete lack of consequences. However, despite the attack, McElroy once again managed to evade serious legal repercussions. Though he was arrested and charged with attempted murder, the trial, in typical McElroy fashion, ended with a lesser charge of assault, and he was quickly released on bail pending appeal. The lack of justice in this case only served to deepen the frustration of the townspeople. McElroy had become a living nightmare for the residents of Skidmore, and his repeated ability to escape punishment was a bitter pill for many to swallow. The Bowenkamp incident revealed that even when McElroy was caught red-handed, the system failed to hold him accountable. This was the final straw for many in Skidmore. The townspeople had endured enough. The legal system had proven ineffective at stopping McElroy, and the community began to feel that their safety and well-being could no longer rely on traditional avenues of justice. Something had to change. In response to this growing sense of fear and frustration, a clandestine meeting was called by the people of Skidmore. The town, though small, had a deep history of community ties and mutual support. As tensions reached their breaking point, it became apparent that the residents were united in their desire to end McElroy's reign of terror. At this meeting, the idea of forming a vigilant pact began to take shape. The message was clear. McElroy could not continue to terrorize the town without consequences. The people of Skidmore, feeling helpless and powerless in the face of the law's failure, quietly formed a pact to deal with the town bully in the only way they felt they could, through direct action. It's important to note that the details of the meeting remain a mystery to this day. Some claim that it was a discussion of creating a neighborhood watch to monitor McElroy's actions. However, it's widely believed that the real agenda was far more sinister. A plan to kill Ken Rex McElroy. The meeting was shrouded in secrecy, and no one outside the group of attendees knows for sure what was said. But the result was clear. A town united in its willingness to take matters into its own hands. The stage was set for McElroy's demise. On July 10, 1981, McElroy, oblivious to the growing animosity directed toward him, arrived at the D&G Tavern in Skidmore. He had been there before, a frequent presence in the town, known for his aggressive behavior and threats. This time, McElroy was with Trina, and though he was likely unaware of it, the townspeople had already gathered at the local Legion Hall for a meeting, where they were likely planning their next steps. When word spread that McElroy had arrived at the bar, the townspeople swiftly made their way to the tavern. It was clear that something was about to happen. McElroy, sensing that he might be in danger, hurriedly finished his drinks, purchased a six-pack of beer, and made his way back to his pickup truck. He climbed in, with Trina beside him, and parked on the main street of Skidmore. At that moment, over 30 residents of the town surrounded his truck. The tension in the air was palpable. McElroy, perhaps not fully aware of the storm that was about to hit him, casually reached for his cigarette, oblivious to the group that was closing in on him. Then, without warning, the shots rang out. Several gunshots were fired into McElroy's truck. Bullets struck him in the head and neck, and Trina screamed in horror as the man who had terrorized her for years fell lifeless. The shooters, acting as a united front, made sure no one could assist McElroy or call for help. He was left to die in broad daylight, in front of a crowd of witnesses who did nothing to stop the killing. McElroy's death was swift, and his reign of terror came to an end. The aftermath of the murder was nothing short of a mystery. Despite the large number of people who had witnessed the shooting, no one came forward to identify the shooters. The police, initially hopeful that they could bring McElroy's killers to justice, quickly realized that no one was willing to cooperate. Investigators discovered multiple bullet casings from two different guns, one from a .22 caliber Magnum and another from an 8mm Mauser. But despite this evidence, no arrests were made. A grand jury was convened, and over 100 interviews were conducted by the FBI. Yet no one was willing to speak up. The townspeople had closed ranks, and the silence was deafening. In the years that followed, Trina would claim that a local rancher named Del Clement had fired one of the fatal shots. But there was no concrete evidence to support this. The police never charged Clement, and no one was ever held accountable for McElroy's murder. The case remains one of the most famous unsolved crimes in Missouri's history, with the people of Skidmore continuing to protect the secrecy of that fateful day. Though McElroy's death brought an end to his reign of terror, it left behind a legacy of fear, silence, and a haunting question. Who killed Ken Rex McElroy? You won't believe the twist that follows in our next video. A coded message found on a body. Can you solve this crime? Hit that subscribe button now to stay in the loop. You won't want to miss it.